Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's AMIC Academy, the future of business travel. For those who don't recognise my voice, I'm Patrick Smith. I'm the principal of the AMIC Academy and the global insurance leader for Deliveroo. So I wear two hats as an interested delegate in today's subject. And we've got a special treat for you today because today's session is in the form of a panel. And you'll hear from senior experts from three major companies that specialize in business travel, from the perspective of insurance, incident management, travel security, medical assistance, and employee assistance programs. Of course, this topic is hugely pertinent right now as we try and understand what business travel will look like going forward and how it will affect or influence the risk landscape for those who take trips as and when the bounce back gathers momentum. And it certainly feels to me as if COVID-19 just reaffirms that we live in a world of perpetual change. And the key question that we as risk managers seek to address is, what do these changes actually mean for businesses, for risk managers, and the travellers themselves? So I'm really looking forward to hearing the views and insights, understanding the implications for our travel protocols and policies, and understand the key takeaways that will help us as risk managers convert the insights into practical actions. So that said, the three companies represented here today are Chubb, one of our valued partners, and Chubb is a leading global business travel insurer, as many of you will know, providing carefully designed solutions to small and medium-sized businesses. And as well as their insurance programs, they help risk managers with their duty of care obligations through Chubb Travel Smart, which is a digital platform to help keep employees safe and informed while at home or when traveling. And Chubb works with a range of specialist medical and security providers as part of the assistance program, meaning that they're on hand 24/7. We have Charles Taylor Assistance, who are a leading provider of medical assistance, travel risk and claims management services. So they're well equipped with the commercial understanding of travel and medical and security assistance and the implications for organizations and their people abroad. And lastly, we have Care First, who is a leading provider of employee assistance programs, otherwise known as EAP, if we like acronyms, to organizations throughout the UK. And the Care First EAP provides 24/7 counselling support and information from professionally trained counsellors and psychotherapists. And they work closely with organisation to support staff and help to reduce absence and boost effectiveness in the workplace by free and confidential support to employees on anything personal or work related. So we've got three great companies combining, which I think will give us a great scope for this session. In terms of logistics, the panel session will last for approximately 40 minutes, breaking at about 1:45 for a Q&A. You'll see on your GoToWebinar control panel, there's a drop down called questions. If you have any questions whatsoever throughout the panel debate, please do pose them there, and then you'll hear my voice again, and on your behalf, I'll help get those questions answered. If you can't see your panel, you may see a little white arrow with an orange background, and that's the display and reveal. And if you want to make any of the slides bigger, or in fact our presenter's face is smaller, you'll see three little horizontal lines right at the top of the slide, and that can enlarge for you. Okay, the slides that you're going to see will be circulated after the event, as will a recording of the session. So you'll have all of the collateral. I think that's it for the time being. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Janine, who's our panel chair, and over to you, Janine.
Thank you. Welcome everybody, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. For those who don't know me, I am Janine Blizzard and I head up the accident health business for Chubb for UK, Ireland, Eurasia and Africa. Thank you, EMIC, for inviting us to host this webinar today. It's greatly appreciated. I would first like to take you through some slides on what we feel is the impact to business travel and what business travellers should expect for the future. According to a recent survey from the Global Business Travel Association, it appears that after months of uncertainty, businesses are starting to plan for a return to some form of business travel. As risk managers, these statistics may resonate, or perhaps you have a different view, and we'd like to hear about those after. I'll just give you a minute to review those. So moving on to the next slide. Taking a look now at Chubb's data that we hold, here we see a projection on the timeline for passenger airline bookings. Now this is for all types of traveller, so it is business and leisure. We're unable to split that out, but hopefully it does give you a good idea on where we feel that the trends are. And based on the moderate outcome, which is the light blue line, we see bookings start to return to post-COVID levels from around January 2021, which is broadly in line with the Global Business Travel Association members for international travel. So, what can business travellers expect? As we've seen, there is no doubt business travel is going to change. And I'm not going to run through each bullet point, you can read those for yourself, but here are some practical implications that we feel employees will experience when they are travelling now post-COVID. So moving on to risk management and how we feel duty of care can be reinforced. What's clear is that risk management frameworks and insurance programs will need to adapt to the changing business travel landscape. Pre-travel preparation will be even more key with this new risk we are facing. Some things to consider, I would suggest, would be, things like the value of the trip may come under more scrutiny from your organisations. Having real-time access to country restrictions would be important. Perhaps the approval process will be more rigorous. And when we look at post-travel, we should be considering about the traveller's well-being. So both physical and mental health, and having that debrief is ever so more important. So let's move on. I didn't want to take up too time on slides as we've got some important panelists here to debate. Let's move on to explore this in more depth. So just to give you a brief, I've just introduced myself, but we also have Natasha Rayut, who is our Head of Accident Health Multinational Business globally for Chubb. And for Charles Taylor, we have Dr. Lynn Gordon, the Chief Medical Officer, and Jonathan Brown, the Risk Team Leader. And for Care First, we have Jack Walsh, a Service Manager, and Carl Bennett, the Business Development Director. So I'd like to open up my first question to the panel. So thinking more about the travel trends that we looked at earlier, what would you see are the key considerations for businesses as they start preparing for travel? Natasha, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Janine. So companies restarting business travel in this really unprecedented times during this global pandemic, post-COVID-19, where we're facing with the new norms, new conditions, will need to really review and update their insurance and risk management programs and protocols. extra attention should be given to the pre-travel assessment, as Janine mentioned, and also perhaps some of the trips that needed approval when the employees were flying to faraway destinations, perhaps at a certain price threshold, need to be revisited. And in the beginning, especially, the approval process should be more diligent. Clear guidelines need to be communicated to employees. It can be done through internet portal, e-learning, any kind of training. I think the main objective here is the prevention of any incidents happening. So as much information as possible needs to be given to employees. So, and ensure that employees are aware of all the risks, right? So COVID-19 is obviously on top of everyone's minds, but we don't need to forget about the traditional risks are still there, and some of them in fact are on the rise. So social unrest, political unrest, or crime, or cyber crime. These are some examples of the risks that you need to be aware of, and employees need to have access to relevant, up-to-date information and assistance. In regards to post-travel, it's important for the businesses to control and analyze in order to keep updating, improving their travel protocols, and also care about the well-being not only of the traveling employees, but of other employees. So perhaps a self-quarantine after a business trip for 14 days would be important. So working from home could be an option. The risk management travel protocols, they need to be agile, need to be adopted, because situation is fluid. As we can see, every day something is happening. And one of the things that businesses should be aware of is also fit to travel protocol. I think this is very important now more than ever.
Thank you, Natasha. Charles Taylor, did you have anything to add for that?
I think the important thing is just to emphasize that the pre-travel risk assessment, which was always important, is now critical. And the duty of care that falls both on the employer as well as the responsibility from the employee have been amplified significantly. So, you know, if I give you a quick example, whereas before, if you had somebody who was diabetic traveling overseas, you didn't really worry too much about it. From an assistance point of view, we worried in terms of were they taking enough medication to last them for the trip. Now you have to worry in terms of, should you be sending them as an employee? Is their risk significant that they really aren't the ideal person to send? And also, if they do get stuck in a lockdown situation, are you going to be able to supply enough medication for them for 3 months rather than 3 days? So, you know, I think as somebody said to me the other day, everything's changed and nothing's changed. And yeah, as Natasha said, the usual medical complications that have occurred with everybody, everyone will still have their heart attacks, their strokes, their car accidents, coming off the back of a moped. But with COVID, everything has changed completely, whether that be from medical facilities to travel to getting people out. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail later. Jonathan, I don't know if you've got anything else that you want to add at this stage.
Yeah, I'd just like to, I think, really emphasize this point about flexibility and having contingency plans for 2 reasons. Partly so that everyone knows what to do if something goes wrong. So if there's a delay or a cancellation or a change, you're not left panicking and without a clue what to do. But also, it's important for friends, family, colleagues, and the business all to know what's going to happen too, both so that they can make plans and know how to react, and also I think for everyone's peace of mind and mental health, which again is another subject we're going to be coming on to later.
Perfect. Thank you, Charles Taylor. Kev first, would you like to add anything?
Nothing for myself, unless Cole's got anything to add on that point. No, that looks great.
Well, other than agreeing really with what people have said, you know, it's I think having control around a situation is so important, and what we're seeing is that people feel that there is this lack of certainty what Lynn mentioned around everything changing and nothing changing rings true with the people that we're hearing. You know, there is an expectation of reality to come back to us very soon, but they need clarity around the mitigations that are being put in place, whether that's around business travel or the work that they're doing. And I think just having a kind of a clear communication process, both of themselves outwardly and from their business to themselves as well, it's so important for people. Control around anxiety is a key.
Perfect, thank you, Carl. So let's explore, I guess, the physical health. And Lynn, you did mention that we could talk more in depth about this. So thinking about the physical health considerations thinking about the physical health considerations around business travel, can you share some of the latest considerations?
Well, I think there's several. So, you know, if we go into them, there are three main points really. So the one is that pre-travel risk assessment. You must have a good idea that the person you're sending out is suitable to be sent out, and that if they do have a risk, they have full understanding of that risk, and that you have put into place processes to mitigate the risk if and when they go out. So if you're sending somebody over to, let's say, Pakistan, have you looked into what facilities are available there if things go wrong? Have you looked into, you know, what happens if we need to bring that person back? So a lot of things in terms of flights, flight availability, that changes on an hourly, never mind a daily basis anymore. Lockdown, as somebody mentioned earlier, you know, you've got to have online access to a system that picks up changes immediately. So if you see that, you know, the number of cases are escalating in a particular province in Spain, you stop your people flying that day and you don't wait to see what's going to happen the next day when they sit in a lockdown situation. The other thing we look at from our side is obviously the facilities. Countries everywhere, including the UK, are being stretched beyond belief in terms of staffing, facilities, consumables. So whereas before we would say, as an example, if somebody had an issue in Nepal, we would automatically take them to Delhi on an air ambulance. Now we're saying we wouldn't take them to Delhi because it's, you know, it's overrun with COVID. There are no beds anywhere. There are no ICU beds anywhere, and normal facilities have just stopped. So all of that is something that you've got to look at when you're looking at, you know, business travel and what are you going to do with that particular individual in terms of anticipating the risks. And I think the main thing to remember is that none of us have got any idea where this is going. So you have to plan for worst case scenario. And if that doesn't happen, fantastic. But if it does happen, you need to be prepared. And certainly from our aspect, and I'm sure Jonathan will discuss that in greater details, you know, risk assessment of the individual and risk assessment of the country are vital.
Thanks, Lynn. You know, I appreciate this remains a very fluid situation, but can you give any country or regional specific guidance? You know, you've given a good example there with Pakistan and Delhi.
Well, I think, you know, if I look, we've just had a very recent case who literally landed about a day or two ago now of getting a patient, a mental health patient from Saudi Arabia to Nigeria. And just getting, you know, obviously the airspace is closed off completely, but is meant to be open for emergency air ambulances. But certainly at the time, that wasn't happening, and it had to go to really high levels. So whereas before authorization would come from the airport itself, it's now going to civil aviation authorities, it's going to directors of aviation in countries, it's going to very high diplomatic levels. And all of that has to be considered when you're doing this type of operation. So to pick out specific countries, I can quite honestly say I don't think there's a single country in the world where there isn't a logistical challenge in some way or another. Jonathan's our risk management expert in terms of countries and facilities, so he's probably got a lot more to say on this.
Could I just add something on actually when is an emergency not an emergency? Because as Lynn mentioned, medical evacuations are generally exempt in theory and by law from a lot of these travel restrictions, but there are still a lot of bureaucratic hurdles that means that actually organising a repatriation can take longer than you expect. But the other factor to bear in mind is that you can have cases which are not emergencies, but which are still serious. So it always used to be the case that there were certain countries, and for example, in East Africa, Somalia, Ethiopia, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, you would always want to evacuate a patient with a serious medical condition to Kenya because the quality of care there was excellent. But if you've got a patient with a broken arm, that's not life-threatening. It's not something you necessarily want treated locally, but because it's not life-threatening, it's not necessarily going to bump you up that prioritization matrix, and you won't necessarily get permission to evacuate that patient. So we're now in this new world, we're looking more at having to keep patients within certain countries to be treated.
I think a prime example of that one is a woman we had who fell and broke her hip in Cuba, literally the day before Cuban airspace shut down completely. And Cuban airspace did not allow in air ambulances even, so there was no possibility to move her out. So she went through the whole operation and rehabilitation process, and 3.5 months later has returned to the UK. You know, so one has to take that into consideration. We always think we'll be able to get people out. In today's climate, it's not always possible.
Thank you, Lynn. So I guess thinking about when employees return from travel, what should employers factor in when checking the health of employees? Charles Taylor, would you like to take that?
I think, you know, you've got to look at things. When people return, you've got two responsibilities. You've got a responsibility to that particular employee who traveled, and then you've got an even more significant duty of care in terms of the rest of the workspace that they're coming back into, to make sure that you're bringing in somebody who is fit and healthy to be there. So they're two very separate entities. I think as well, you know, in today's climate, I think travel and business travel was always stressful in the past. It is now very much uncharted territory. People have to be a lot more resilient and a lot more agile when it comes to being prepared for what may or may not happen. Little things like newspapers on flights which don't exist, but more importantly, that very important bottle of water that comes around to you at frequent intervals if you're sitting in business class may not happen anymore. So the person going out may be very different to the person coming back, who may be significantly stressed, have been significantly stressed about family, friends, work colleagues, etc. So in terms of them coming back, we shouldn't just take it for granted, you know, that Jack's back from the US, he must have had a lovely trip, or so-and-so's back from the Far East, you know, lucky them, they got to go shopping in Hong Kong. You know, that's a very different world that we're living in now, and we've got to, as employees, look and factor in what do we need to help those people when they come back. And some people will need nothing, and other people will need a huge amount of support. But we also need to look at things like, you know, is COVID testing necessary before they go back into the workplace? Quarantine regulations seem to change on a day-by-day basis, and if anybody understands Boris's attitude, please let me know. But you know, an employee going out on a Tuesday, coming back the next week, maybe coming back into a very different environment. So it's just a case of being prepared to deal with it and know exactly what you're looking at in terms of, again, risk management for that particular person and for your workplace.
Perfect, thank you, Lynn. So let's look at the mental health side of things, because I'd be interested to see what Care First could assist with. So when it comes to the mental health implications for business travellers, what are the key considerations that we should be considering? Jack or Carl?
Yeah, well, I can jump in first, and then obviously I can hand over to Carl to add anything onto it. I think the underlying theme that comes out from the conversation and the things that we're seeing of late is that although we're all in the same situation and in the same boat, how that situation impacts one person to the next is completely different. And when there is change and when there is a lack of control in our life, that can have an impact on our mental well-being and can kind of cause those worries and that increased anxiety. And that's very much what we're seeing at the moment around business and other work considerations. Increased anxieties and worries and fears, simple things around just our general health and safety during the lockdown, what that looks like when we're traveling, what precautions we take, are the masks we're wearing right and appropriate, or does that then spike and my anxiety levels and then transmission to family and friends, things like that. But I think business travel, generally speaking, away from COVID as well, has its own implications. If we look at the relationship people have during travel, if they're out a lot, separation anxiety from family, burnout and physical impacts in terms of our sleep and our diet and our weight. I know we've covered the physical health side of things a little bit, mental health and health, have a direct correlation to each other, and there's lots done on both sides of the fence. Other one. So there's lots of those considerations for people at the moment, which I think, unfortunately, like a lot of mental health worries and issues, are not as quantifiable as a physical condition. So I think it's just being mindful that those are the day-to-day experiences people as they start to return to business travel, in the current circumstances with heightened restrictions, and hopefully those worries and those anxieties will alleviate as and when those restrictions start to lift more and more in the coming months and years. Cole, you add anything else to that?
I just want to check first, Jack. Your mic, I couldn't hear you very well. I don't know if other people were having that experience as well.
No, it was going in and out, but I was trying to be polite to wait for him to take a breath before I say perhaps Carl could contribute.
I'll plug my backup mic.
Yeah, no. What Jack what Jack is saying is that obviously when it comes to the implications and looking at for things for employees, I know I mentioned it before, but it's around being aware of more than the employer might, more than you might consider the employee is expecting. I think as an employer, we've got a responsibility that we're taking into consideration all elements of an employee's well-being. That's keeping them in control of what the organisation's standing is around things. Also, trying to manage their fears, worries, or anxieties around generally travelling during what is a very unusual and ever-changing environment. We don't know what I think Lynn said a moment ago, or Jonathan. We don't know what tomorrow's going to look like, let alone next week, with regards to changes within the country that might be where your base is. Having a real understanding of what's happening with the country that you're travelling to increases those levels of anxiety, because they probably aren't aware of those changes. Changes can literally happen while people are in the air in many circumstances. But away from that, people are also concerned about the impact on their friends and family when they return as well. Transmission of the virus from overseas, also kind of general emotional burnout from any of the anxieties or stresses that they're experiencing, that you'd expect anyway from business travel, sleep, diet, weight, all of those kind of things. But when they're impacted even more with social isolation, which may be something that is forced upon somebody for the country that they're going into, if they're not within a particular travel tunnel, then it means that when they come back from whatever country they're traveling from, it may put themselves in and their families into a situation that their job has forced their family into as well. So it's important that employers are discussing with their employee the worries or concerns that they might be experiencing well before they leave for the trip, and then when they're coming back, making sure that they've got the plans and preparations in recognising any of those things that we've just mentioned. And being alert to it as well. I think if organisations and managers and of organisations are aware that their employees will be experiencing a very different way of thinking during any of their journeys. And the key to being able to manage any of those is communication. You're talking to people, allowing them to ensure that they can talk themselves about the things that are worrying them, and as an organisation that they recognise that they might need that little bit of extra support, and that's always the way that we would suggest that managers operate. I know I've repeated a lot of what Jack said, Ben, so apologies. I was just aware that the microphone went down.
Well, yeah, I struggled, so thank you for clarifying that for those who couldn't hear. So Carl, could you share any practical tips for business travellers or employers when it comes to managing mental health, given the new normal now with COVID?
Yeah, definitely. Again, it's discussing those coping mechanisms with the employee. There's a really good, I won't go into the details, but there is some really good articles about sort of the 5 ways to well-being, or the 5 stresses that people experience during times of particularly heightened levels of change. And that's some good articles to read around that. And if you're talking with your employees about the mechanisms that they might have, or that those articles might explain, things like mindfulness, exercise, the link between physical and emotional well-being is so well documented that's why I mentioned before about sleep and exercise and eating. You know, if managers are taking are offering good practical advice to employees, and making sure that they're engaging with the people that can make the differences within their organisation, as they're talking to HR, or making sure that they're speaking with occupational health or their GPs if they've got any issues that they might be recognising as an employer. There's also definitely an area for when managers are talking with groups of people, that they talk to them about taking care of one another from an emotional perspective, making sure that if they are talking to people and recognizing that there are signs of stress that they might be experiencing during those conversations, that they flag it with the individual, asking them, is everything okay? And then helping them to support with any of the issues that they might be experiencing. I don't know if you'd add any more to that, Jack.
I hope I can. My mic should be working now.
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly. Thank you, Jack.
If anyone can see me, I tried to avoid using the air traffic controller headset today, but obviously not gonna be able to do that. Just to kind of recap everything that Carl was saying, really, I think a lot of the things we do is it's not rocket science. It's a lot of the self-help tips that we can do in our day-to-day lives. Just a couple of the key ones for 5 ways to well-being and things we can adopt in our lives around business travel. Staying connected with people is really, really key, and that might be people within the office, your colleagues, your manager, your team leader, stuff like that. Having those regular conversations, not just about work, but just general catch-ups and having a little chit-chat here and there. And absolutely staying connected with people in our personal life as well, friends, family, kids, like that. And another little tip, probably one of the 5 ways that stands out most for me, which is a really good way to stay on top of our physical and mental well-being, and gives us an opportunity to have some downtime away from work and away from home, which can be done whilst we're traveling for business or at home, is learning a new skill or trying something completely different. And if we are traveling somewhere, maybe we try learning the language of the place we're going, or a new sport or a new hobby, or things like that. It just allows us to shift our focus away from work and away from our personal life onto something completely different, and just give ourselves that kind of mental break from any of those stresses that Carl's mentioned.
Thank you guys. Very, very helpful tips there. Was there anything else that Charles Taylor would like to add, or Natasha?
I think we have to remember as well, that everybody who's listening in on this call at the moment, or looking in at it, has experienced in some ways the forms of isolation that remote working and home working has induced. If you then take that and give that to a business traveller who's now moving to a foreign environment, an even less supported environment, we have to recognise that those stresses are going to be amplified. So as you know, whether you're a manager, employer, whatever, your duty of care becomes greater, and your responsibility in terms of support of that person, again, is something that needs to be escalated up the chain a little bit. So that's something we mustn't forget, that somebody who sitting here in the UK might be very independent, seem to be doing quite well. What we're seeing is that those people moved into business situations unsupported are the ones who are kind of just tipping slightly over the edge. So just have a general awareness of that.
Yeah, and I just, sorry, I just want to add one more thing. I think one of the main concerns that I had actually a couple of trips booked for March to go to Singapore and Japan myself. And it was kind of just the beginning, right? So I wasn't sure, but my main kind of stress and anxiety was apprehension of being stuck somewhere abroad, away from my family. So what if I flew? I was completely fine, but then my temperature was elevated, and I would, you know, the temperature would be checked at the arrival, and then I would be in a government facility for 2 weeks, just away from, you know, everyone. So that was my main concern from personal experience, just being stuck abroad. And I think it's super important for people that are on certain medications, right? We did have recently a situation where one of our clients, he was stuck in Peru, and it was an 8-hour drive place from Lima. And he was there, his medication was running out. He didn't have COVID-19, but he had a medical condition that his medication was running out. And there was no taxi, no any commercial transportation available. So we were able to help him to do it through like just private means to get him out and get him back to the US.
Thank you, Natasha. Jonathan, sorry, were you going to add something?
Yeah, it actually kind of picks up on Natasha's point as well, actually. And the point I was making earlier about preparation and flexibility. Obviously, we all hope when we travel that nothing goes wrong, and our plans are contingencies for in case something goes wrong. But I think it's worth, partly for the sake of mental health reassurance, and partly for more practical reasons, it is worth thinking about what would happen if you were quarantined somewhere for 14 days, for example. Not necessarily ill, so your physical health is not in danger, but are you, if you get quarantined somewhere, are you going to miss a child's birthday? If so, plan for that. So have you left a present for them? Do you know how you're going to communicate with them? Will you be able to use Wi-Fi in a country that you would normally avoid because of security concerns? Have you got books with you? Have you thought about how you will fill that time? Hopefully you won't need to do it, but if you do, you will have a better idea what to do. Your family will have a better idea of what you're going through. So I say it's not, we plan for contingencies, but I'm also saying mentally think about what those contingencies will involve if you have to use them.
Thank you, Jonathan. Very, very helpful. So we've got a few minutes left. So I guess I'd like to really move to sort of the insurance side of things, selfishly enough. So I guess looking at insurance programs, I'd like to understand a bit more, or contribute hopefully, along with Natasha, about insurance program response, and what are the key considerations for risk managers when reviewing and arranging business travel insurance programs. Natasha?
Yeah, sure, Janine. So speaking of business travel insurance programs, we should not forget, as I mentioned before, the traditional risks still exist. Natural disasters happen, crime happens, auto accidents, etc. So it is important to have a comprehensive, robust insurance program. And for organizations, it's important to assess their needs. And I know that a lot of insurance carriers would develop like a customized bespoke policies. And I already mentioned that as well. It has to be agile. It needs to keep pace with the changing landscapes. So we've gone through one wave, there is a second wave, and I heard that actually Hong Kong is going through a third wave. So the lockdowns, restrictions, they're being lifted, they're being reinforced. So our recommendation is for any business traveler to ensure that when you buy a ticket, it's important to buy a changeable, fully refundable ticket, more important than ever. So the Foreign Office advice also is changing daily. They're using new terminology, like for example, air bridges. Air bridge between UK and France is open, but it can close again. And speaking of the core benefits, right? The core benefits are the 24/7 medical security assistance helpline and medical expenses. We have gone through a number of different pandemics, not obviously global like this one that is not really located in one space, right? It's global, but we have dealt with Zika, Ebola pandemics in the past. And most of our claims that we have paid out have been trip cancellations and medical expenses and hospitalizations. Other core benefits are also important is the evacuation repatriations. And in some situations, especially that that we're dealing with such unprecedented times, perhaps like an extra care is important. So companies should really kind of study well and update their insurance programs. Companies should also look at the transparency of insurance carriers. You know, ask questions, see if the insurance carrier posts some sort of FAQs related to claims to COVID-19. And of course, very important is to ensure that you know, the claims, the customer service is up to the par. And we have, you know, we have been receiving weekly reports on COVID-19 claims all the time, and our company has been paying a lot of, and mostly medical expenses, evacuations, repatriations, and trip cancellations.
Thank you, Natasha. So I guess
Janine, I don't know if you want to add to something to that.
No, I guess you've covered off the key things. When you look at your insurance program, you know, make sure that there's medical expenses cover if business travelers do need to travel, that there's no any specific COVID restrictions on your medical expenses section. You know, that's a good tip about flexible tickets. So then you can be fluid in business travel. But yeah, I guess just check that there is that the program's fit for purpose, and if there has been any amendments since COVID, what does that mean for your insurance program? And you know, just check with your brokers and seek that advice of, if we were to start sending our travelers abroad again, or are currently doing that, does the program support the risks that we face and will reimburse us for our insurance means?
One more thing I just want to add, because of the multinational aspect of my job, is that we at Chubb, we don't have any plans to add any COVID-19 exclusions for corporate business travel insurance. So that cover still is in place. However, there's some countries, and one country comes to mind is Vietnam, that just recently there was a government regulation where they have mandated to add COVID-19 exclusion to the local policies. So, but of course, if you have a UK control master program in place, then the difference of conditions, difference of limits would apply, and your employees in other countries will be covered under that.
Thank you, Natasha. So I guess one final question before we wrap up, and it's really in respect to thinking about the overall duty of care obligations. So how do you think the current crisis has and will impact this for the businesses? I'm more than happy to open that up to anybody on the panel.
Well, I'll just start and you guys can contribute that. So the most important concern of any organization should be health, well-being, safety of their employees, especially when they travel in such crazy, unprecedented times. Legislation of duty of care, it varies quite a bit around the world, and the case law continues to refine the duty of care obligations. So I think COVID-19 situation brought much more focus on the importance of duty of care, of having that important risk management and insurance program in place. Prevention having the risk assessed, planned strategically, developed updated protocols, including, the extra approval levels, communication training, tracking, informing, controlling it, and analyzing the situation, keeping it agile. So this prevention measures far outweigh costs versus if something happens to employees. And one last thing I just want to say, that fit to travel, I think is super important, because like some of our clients are oil and gas executives, and they're used to traveling all the time, but they're a certain age, they're not in the best shape, some of them, and some of them have diabetes. So, and they are more susceptible, of course, to COVID-19. So you throw COVID-19 into that mix and you have some, potentially really large problems. So watch out for that.
Thank you, Natasha. So unfortunately, I think we've run out of time, Patrick, haven't we?
Well, I think we've perfectly timed for the Q&A, and we've had some nice questions. So should we get stuck into that and we can carry on the conversation?
Okay,
I think one initial observation is that this seems to be a classic case and a perfect example of insurance as a service when I hear the panel debate. And one of the things that has come through the audience here, and I'll combine 2 points really. So what is the best way to ensure that travellers know what to do? In other words, the best practices on how an organisation prepares its business travellers, and particularly at the point of an event, where of course, the scenario may be highly charged with the stress and emotion that you talked about. So I'm wondering whether the panel have got any observations on best practices that they've seen amongst the organisations that they serve.
I think it's got to be a case of quick accessibility. So your first thing, going back again, is that you've got to have a superb pre-travel risk assessment program, both of the individual going out and also of the area that they're going out to, in addition to the areas that they're transiting through. Following on from that, then you have to look at different factors. But I think that the main one is that pre-travel risk assessment. If you can do that and do that well, then you've got 50% of the problem out the way. Make sure that your employee going out knows exactly who to call when things go wrong, that they've got a number for a 24/7 access, whether that's work, whether it's medical assistance company, whoever it is. But at the point when things go wrong, that's not the point where you want somebody panicking. That's the point where they reach for one number and they get through to somebody who can help. That's essential.
So there seems to be 2 facets there. What do you do before the trip, and how do you create accessibility on the trip if something goes wrong? If we could just look at the pre-travel risk assessment, if our audience of risk managers here were thinking about reviewing theirs if they have one, or creating one if they don't, what would be the high level kind of component parts to that, do you think?
I think, yeah, go on.
Just with a few thoughts. I think one of the silver linings that might come out of this whole pandemic crisis is that a lot of theoretical knowledge is now being applied, and people are thinking about it much more actively than they used to. So in terms of kind of a high level points to consider, I would say risk assessment as a principle. Do you need to travel? What are the health concerns of your traveller and their family unit or bubble? Do they have any illnesses on the day of travel? Research and prepare. So look at the official advice from the country you're traveling from about your destination. Look at what your destination's advice is for travelers. Bear in mind advice about transit points along the route as well. Understand that the experience of travel will be different. So accommodation may be more expensive, it may be limited what you can do in a hotel. You're going to be sharing spaces with people that ordinarily would not be a problem, and now is going to be potentially causing you stress. There may be restrictions on wearing masks on travel, there may be requirements to have coronavirus testing and so on. And then be flexible, and as I said, have contingency plans. So delays in this context might be more than just the few hours that are normally your worst case scenario. You might now be delayed for days or weeks. Think about what you will do in a minor emergency as well as a major emergency. So if you have a heart attack, in a sense it's easy. You call out an ambulance and go to hospital. If you're just feeling sick, it can be more complicated because you're then trying to weigh up what the risks are of staying put or seeking help. And this comes back to that point about knowing who you can contact, know who your medical assistance company is, know how to contact them. And finally, I would say, think about how this applies to the individual, as I say, their family, and also the business. So you don't necessarily normally think about all of those different factors, but I think now we've got really the opportunity to do so.
Great.
I pick up as well from that, Jonathan, really, just to say about the responsibility to family members. We're going to be a very different community of travellers, of workers in the months and years ahead. And the responsibility isn't just to the employee, it is to the family group as well. You mentioned a really good point earlier about making sure that you make preparations as an employee or as a traveller to make sure that if you do miss birthdays and things like that, that you prepare for the worst case scenario. There's also a piece there around recognizing the emotional impact on family members. You know, if you are traveling, then to you it may feel very normal, and to the individual it feels like you are just processing the information for yourself, but you're not. Every business trip that's taken across land, road or air at the moment, it is the family that is traveling, not the individual alone. And I think if employers and risk assessors take into account the impact that it would have on a family rather than just an individual, that's something that going forwards I think organizations are going to have to take more and more responsibility for, because the impact is not just emotional, it's financial, it could be physical. There are so many implications to take into account that what was once one person, now many more people.
Well, can I add one other thing very quickly, and that's we really do have an opportunity to learn and develop institutional memory and experience now. Every time you've got a traveller coming back, talk to them about their experience and what the challenges were that they faced. Under normal circumstances, you don't perhaps need to do that because whatever challenges they faced may be seen to be one-offs and they dealt with them. But this really is an opportunity to learn and have a constant feedback loop.
Well, thank you very much for those thorough responses, because I think from a practical perspective, there's some great takeaways there. And obviously, you know, working in large organizations, I guess as we all do actually, but we could really enrich that kind of business travel sign-off process. And whereas previously, often it's simply just been about, is it in the budget, yes or no? You know, is there something on the Foreign and Commonwealth Office that says we can't? And if those two get ticked, off you go. So I think the focus for risk managers to think about how to bleed some of these very necessary risk mitigation actions into existing processes so that they can be embedded pretty seamlessly is important, and probably no better time to do it now because it's so topical. So thank you for that. You covered quite a bit around the insurance side, and obviously that was with the prism of the current insurance as it's designed. So without delving deeply into whether current insurance wordings either work or don't, do you see travel insurance and travel insurance responses, claims responses, redesigning in time to accommodate maybe some of the kind of issues that COVID-19 has exposed, or do you see simply not much change there? What do you think?
Oh, from Chubb's insurance carrier perspective, of course, we're looking at different ways we can innovate and improve our products, both group personal accident and business travel insurance. So we are working hard on developing some new propositions. So one of them, I'm hoping that we will have more news in the next month or so, but directional care is something that is very important, and we're seeing there's quite a bit of demand for services like, for example, telemedicine. So we're definitely looking into that. I don't want to spill any beans, but we constantly are improving, and I think looking at the COVID-19 situation, what it has brought up, the issues, it definitely gives us more material to work with. The core benefits, I mean, of course, the medical expenses, evacuations, and trip cancellation, we call them trip inconveniences, are there, but we are working on developing some extra coverages.
Great. So I think as a community, we'll wait patiently by, but should see some interesting positive activity. I think one of the things many risk managers think about a lot is really stress testing, if you like, claims scenarios. And I hear loud and clear that for the business traveler, really simplicity is the key. You know, if something goes wrong, one number to ring. Are you finding that risk managers are commonly now seeking to really understand how a major incident might be responded to, if you like, before the event? So how things like employees might be supported if they're stranded, or medical support. So that kind of scenario testing, is that becoming more common?
I think it probably is. But just to make a very quick point, I think there are so many different scenarios that I think the best thing we can do in a lot of cases is simply to put questions to an organization for them to think about and apply them to the plans that they have in place. There are so many different variables that unless you want to devote a lot of time and resource to actually having an in-depth conversation or sort of really getting into the details of a particular trip, then you have to do the work yourself. I think you have to be prepared to ask the questions and think about the implications.
So I suppose the takeaway for risk managers is to have some sort of business travel risk framework that you can throw specific questions at. And I suppose that the kind of organizations who've prepared for our Academy session today are very well placed to actually help inform what that framework might look like. So if we just turn to some closing remarks, I mean, today has been very insightful, and I think we have had some very practical takeaways. So thanks to all of our panelists. I think what I'm hearing is prepare, prepare, prepare. And I'm also hearing that whilst the session was characterized as business travel, we're really talking about people risk. And when we talk about people risk, I mean, people are everywhere in organizations, and it's a classic case of, in inverted commas, ERM, because actually we all own somewhat the health and well-being of our colleagues in our organization. I think with COVID, and it's quite clear that, you know, with some territories going into third waves, you know, we don't know how high the bounce back's going to be. We don't know when it's going to be. In the context of business travel, we don't know whether it will be a slow build back to normality. Maybe everyone's so stir crazy, there's going to be a huge surge in business travel once people are allowed to do it. Or maybe it will never return to how it felt before. I think the piece of advice around, you always have to these days assume that travel may somewhat be disrupted some way or other. So actually, when we think about our business travel budgets, maybe it's not about the cheapest fare. Maybe it is about, you know, the flexibility that we might need. Hopefully we won't, but if you have the wrong air ticket at the wrong cost, you might consider that an own goal. In case of an incident, it's vital to focus on practical steps and logistics. Of course it is. You know, what do we do? What's the list of things to be done? But we're reminded, I think, through this session to ask the question about the employee's mental health. And I think that's an interesting point, because in thinking about mental health, do we have the necessary capability to spot stress and disorder? And I'm no psychiatrist. I reckon I'd have a good go, but I'm no psychiatrist. So I think thinking about how do we measure and how do we judge well-being, particularly in a time of crisis, is important. And clearly, where we're talking about people risk, close liaison with the people managers in our companies, as well as the central people / HR team, is quite critical, because we're really talking about care first, excuse the pun, risk second, and insurance third. And if we get it in that order, then routinely we'll really be thinking about how to mitigate business travel risks that actually, you know, are changing and are evolving. So with that, my final remarks, I'd like to say a group thank you to our presenters today for all of those insights and practical support, and to all of the audience, our AMIC members, giving up their time to listen and learn. So with that, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
And thank you, AMIC.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you all.